Welcome to Edible Education 101. We're glad you're here. Okay, tonight we're going to begin a series of 4 lectures on how the food movement should address the major issues that were presented to you in the first 5 lectures. Now, during the middle part of the course, you were hearing from people who are changing the way that food is produced and delivered to consumers here in California. But the food system is a lot bigger than just California, and it's a lot more complicated than just producing the food and delivering it to consumers. And so we could not have a better person to lead off in this series of 4 lectures than our speaker tonight, who is Claire Kremen. She is co-director of the Center for Diversified Farming Systems here at Berkeley, so she knows exactly what the people in the middle part of the course were talking to you about. She is also the co-director of the Berkeley Food Institute, which has this broad purview of the social and economic and global dimensions of the food system. So she understands the complexity that goes with that system. Besides this, she happens to be one of the stars in her department here on campus. She is a recipient of a MacArthur Fellowship. This is the one that people call the Genius Fellowship, and she's had a number of other awards. She has, I think, an intuitive ability to put her arms around a complex system like the food system is, and to begin to talk about ways in which it can be fixed that are both integrative and holistic. So I think we are very, very fortunate to have her to lead us into this later part of the class. So please welcome Claire Kremen.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much, Gary, for that very kind introduction. I will try to do it justice. And good evening also to all the listeners who are out there on the internet listening to this remotely. So, fixing a broken food system, I'd like to offer some ideas. It's a very complex and difficult topic, and so these are just some ideas that could contribute. I want to start by something that I'm sure you already know about. There has been this tremendous increase in food production since 1960. This is really the triumph of our modern agricultural system, that we've nearly tripled food production since 1960, much outstripping population growth that happened at the same time. And for that reason, we actually have much more food produced per capita. In fact, we're awash in calories in a way. We produce 4,600 kilocalories per capita per year, per day, I'm sorry. And that is far more, of course, than any one person would need to eat. But at the same time, this paradox, we have about 1 billion people that are chronically hungry, and we also have another 1 billion, the hidden hunger, so 2 billion in total with micronutrient deficiencies. And on top of that, we have a growing problem with obesity, 800 million people globally obese. Often such people are also micronutrient deficient because it is too many calories but of the wrong kind. And so, as Amartya Sen famously said, starvation is the characteristic of some people not having enough food to eat. It is not the characteristic of there being not enough food to eat. While the latter can be a cause of the former, it is but one of many possible causes. So we are producing so much food, it is not being distributed to those in need of that food. And our food system is failing us in this way, but also in many other ways. And as I'm sure you've also learned in this course up until now, modern agriculture is fundamentally unsustainable from an environmental perspective. One of the issues is soil erosion and the loss of agricultural lands, of arable lands. With our modern farming systems, we are eroding soils far faster than we can generate them. And this is a fundamental issue of sustainability. We cannot have agriculture without protecting our soils. We use 70% of fresh water supplies for agriculture. We're at capacity in using that water, and yet our agriculture needs to expand even more. How will we do that? At the same time as we use that water, we are also degrading its quality, causing pollution. We now have 400 dead zones, oceanic dead zones around the world, in part due to agricultural runoff. And agriculture is our number one environmental offender often. It's our number one contributor to climate change, contributing about 30 to 35% of emissions from tropical deforestation, and also methane emissions from livestock production and from rice agriculture, and then nitrous oxides from the use of synthetic nitrogen fertilizers. So these are just some of the contributors. And agriculture is our number one offender as well for biodiversity loss. Agriculture has already converted about 40% of natural habitats from former natural habitats, and so that's a huge impact on biodiversity. But one of the impacts today is that new agricultural expansion is happening in the tropical forests and often attacking the primary tropical forests, which are the richest areas for terrestrial biodiversity. So we have all those environmental issues, and at the same time we have to think about what's happening in the future. Of course, we have population growth, and we also have a more prosperous population that is desiring to eat more and more meat and other luxury products. And as a result of this, various projections have suggested that by 2050, we will actually need to double the amount of food that we produce in order to meet the population needs and the consumption demands. But this is a really important point. The question is often asked, how will we double food production by 2050 to feed the world, but without destroying it in the process? We're already at the limits of sustainability. We see that. How could we possibly double food production? The important point is that doubling food needs is a prediction. It's not a prescription. It is not a policy goal. Yet many international and government documents have transformed this doubling prediction to a policy goal. And I'll be going into this in more detail in the first half of this talk. So what is the prediction based on? The assumptions include, first of all, that population will increase to 9 to 10 billion. Second, that consumption patterns will continue to change with increased affluence, as we have seen them doing. And finally, that food waste will continue at the level it is currently, which is 30 to 40%. And it is certainly reasonable to make these predictions based on business as usual. But in theory, each of these can be altered. And so I want to talk about that in the first half of the talk. It's also important to think when we talk about feeding the world, this concept of feeding the world. There's no such thing as a global stomach. And there's also no central authority that manages food production and makes decision on a global scale about how we should produce food. So the concept of feeding the world is kind of strange in that sense. And further, as we know, we already produce enough food to feed the world, but yet we do not feed the world. The world is not being fed. There are many hungry people. So this leads me to suggest that the question needs to be reframed. And we could reframe it as, how do we create a resilient and sustainable food system that meets human needs? So first, let me start by offering some sort of working definition of what a resilient and sustainable food system might be. So here's my working definition. All people have access to sufficient, nutritionally adequate food or the means to produce it. And food is produced and distributed sustainably and equitably. The system is resilient to environmental and social shocks. So if that was our goal, instead of doubling food to meet some predicted needs, then what would it take to create this resilient and sustainable food system? So I'm going to divide my talk into two parts. And the first part is about working towards alternative futures that would reduce these future food needs, and thus the environmental and social stressors that would accompany trying to produce more food than we already are. So I'll talk about how we could achieve smaller population size, how we could reduce meat and dairy consumption, and how we could reduce food waste. And then I want to talk about shifting perspective from this notion of a sort of central authority feeding the world to people feeding themselves. So thinking about moving from food aid towards a food sovereignty framing, moving from industrial towards agroecological and diversified farming systems, and then moving from corporate control towards democratically determined food systems. So this is the roadmap for my talk. I will go fairly quickly through the first part, and then linger a lot on the second part, because that's really where my own scholarship is. So let's start with talking about alternative futures and with population. This is just a critical component of the whole picture of sustainability. So this is a typical population curve that you'll see. And of course, there's been really, really rapid population growth since 1960. Just about every decade, we add about 12 billion or so people to the planet. I'm sorry, did I say 12 billion? 1 billion people to the planet every decade. I'm bad with numbers, so we see that already. And the idea is that around 2050 or so, we should be leveling off at around 9 billion people. And that's the standard population projection that is put into these kinds of models that talk about the need to double food production by 2050. But this is just a model. And as my colleague Malcolm Potts is fond of saying, this is not fixed, this is variable. It depends on what happens. And if we look at some different country situations, we can see that there can be lots of different types of scenarios. So a country's population size is very much determined by the total fertility rate of women. So how many children each woman has in her lifetime. And this shows for the United States how total fertility rates have changed over a very long period. Over about 100 years, they went from about 7 children per woman over her lifetime to what it is today, about 2. But this can happen, and so this transition happened slowly, and is typical of what we call the demographic transition, that over time, as people become more affluent, more educated, and also have the ability to control family size, then they do control family size, and family size diminishes. But let's take a look at Bangladesh, a very different country, and they also had a very, very rapid decline in total fertility rate, but over a much shorter period, just 20 years. So how did this happen? This is not a country that experienced a huge increase in wealth. It's still a very poor country. But there, what happened is that the government recognized that really the key to economic development, to economic prosperity, would be to reduce household family sizes and to reduce their overall population. And so what they did is to really make it a huge priority to make family planning accessible and make information about family planning available. So they created family planning centers, and most importantly, they went out to their population, many of whom were rural and isolated, and brought family planning information and materials to them. So I'm going to show a short film clip to show you how this took place, and hopefully this will work.
Taslima and Hanan come from large families themselves, but they've decided to have just 2 children.
বাংলাদেশে এখন একটা স্লোগান আছে যেটা সবার ঘরে ঘরেই জানে যে 2টি সন্তানের বেশি নয়, একটি হলে ভালো হয়।
আমার ভাগ্য ভালো যে আমার যে 2টা সন্তান, অনেক সন্তান হইলে তো তাদের প্রস্তুতি দিতে পারতাম। 2টা সন্তান যে মনের মতন তো তাদের যেটা চাওয়ার এটা পূরণ করতে পারতেছি।
তোমার আর কি?
আমার পকেট খালি হয়ে গেছে।
Taslima and Hanan are part of a cultural shift away from big families. And for Taslima, it's also become a job. She works for the government family planning service, which employs women like her in every village. She goes door to door to try to help others to have smaller families too.
মাসে গেছেন আজকে কতদিন? এইদিকে 22 তারিখে। তারপর আর কোনো পদ্ধতি নেন নাই? তাহলে সমস্যা হবে না আমার বাচ্চা কনসেপ্ট হয়ে যাবে
আমার তো মনে করেন হয়তো অনেক দেরি হতে পারছে না এই যে
তারপরও আপনি এখন তো 2টা বাচ্চা হয়ে গেছে
আমি ধরে গেলাম না এবারে সবার লেগে যাই না
Taslima offers advice, moral support, and most importantly, a range of contraceptives.
এগুলো কন্ডম আপনি তো 3টা মেয়ে এখন আর বাচ্চা নেই
Okay, so you get the idea there. So the point is that not only in Bangladesh but in many countries there's a large unmet need for family planning, and what this shows here, the data here, are the proportion of contraceptive demands that are satisfied for married women of childbearing age, and so you can see here that the inverse of that is going to be the proportion that's unsatisfied. So it's a large proportion in Africa, between 50 and 65%. In the Middle East and North Africa, about 25%, Eastern Europe, 20%, Asia, about 35%, Latin America, about 25%. So there's a large unmet need for family planning. I've experienced this myself. In my travel and work in Madagascar, I often came across rural families that wished that they could control family size, would find that their own lives could be more prosperous, that they could take care of the children that they had if they could have smaller families, but they had no means to do so. So it's interesting to look at population projections if contraceptive needs could be met. This is a kind of complicated graphic, but what you see here is first here with the red arrow is the typical business as usual scenario, leveling off at about 9 billion people. This is if fertility rates would very gradually decline from their current average just slightly, and mortality rates would also be declining. We'd level off at about 9 billion people. But what would happen if contraceptive needs could be met? This is an estimate looking at if just the 16% annual unwanted pregnancies could be avoided each year, then we would end up leveling off at actually about where we are right now, at about 7 billion. So we would have the same population as we do now. And this is a kind of a low measurement of the unmet need for family planning. That unmet need is probably greater than this, but this is one way of getting at that. It's also encouraging to realize that other countries, including other poor countries with relatively with low literacy rates, like Bangladesh, could also reduce the total fertility rate. So in Iran, they managed to do it very, very quickly in only 5 years. And in Thailand also very quickly. And again, these were the kinds of programs that were similar in terms of lots of government support for meeting the unmet need for family planning. These are not coercive programs. So it's important to realize that population is a variable, not a given, and that it is possible to imagine smaller total populations in the future. So going to the second point about changing consumption patterns. So right now, we produce all of these crops, and about 55% of that is directly for human food, but a huge amount, 36%, goes to feed livestock, not people. And then a smaller but still significant chunk is for our crops that are being used for biofuels. And the issue here is that there's such an incredible it's so incredibly inefficient to produce crops that are then fed to livestock that we then eat because of the conversion inefficiencies. The caloric conversion efficiency for dairy is about 40%, but for beef it's only about 3%. And so across the board, if you think about the distribution of these products that we're making, the amounts of these products that we're making, this 36%, there's a loss of about 90% of those calories by the time it gets to people, actually. And you can think of that as a form of wastage. So that 36% becomes only 4% of calories that are delivered to people, along with the 55% that is directly consumed of all the crops that are being produced. And we can look at this on a map as well and see that here in the United States, this scaling shows the calories delivered to the food system per calorie produced. And so what it's showing is that here in the United States, we produce an enormous amount of calories through all the grains that we produce, but very little of it is actually delivered to people. It's being delivered to livestock, and that conversion efficiency is so low. In contrast, in a place like Africa, it's not nearly as productive, not producing nearly as much, but a lot more of what it's producing is actually going directly to people. So if we were to shift just half of the crops used for livestock feed and biofuels to direct food production, that would provide sufficient calories for 2 billion more people. And then our problem of the hungry, food insecure people would actually vanish. Of course, and this would greatly reduce the stress on the system. We wouldn't be essentially producing all this food that ends up getting wasted. It would also have other benefits in terms of shifting to healthier diets, since eating lots of meat is not healthy. It shifts to healthier diets across the income spectrum because, of course, many people are not getting the calories that they need or the protein that they need, and making these available would certainly help with that. But again, this is sort of the big brother perspective. This is the feeding the world perspective. We can't just magically change these things and shift half of the crops that are currently going from for livestock feed and biofuels to directly feed people. It doesn't work that way. So I'll come back to that later. And then the third the third way that we could change, have an alternative future in terms of how much food we need to produce, is to think about food waste. There's so much food is being wasted, 30 to 40%. And this varies greatly by region. The causes of food waste vary. So in the developing countries, you can see that a lot of the food waste is in the step of the production step, production to retailing. And so what's going on here is that there's the lack of facilities, of infrastructure for getting products to market or for storing products. So a lot of stuff gets wasted at the front end, in the field itself or on the way to market. But in developed countries, we have food waste that's happening at that stage, but also very much at the consumer stage as well. And there's a lot of different reasons for this. Some of the food waste that we have at the production stage might be because products are deemed unsuitable for some reason, even for a cosmetic reason, or due to just simply sort of inefficient arrangements between farmers and buyers, so that food gets wasted on the field. But there are also issues of labeling. So we end up wasting a lot of food because of confusing food labels that don't necessarily differentiate between when you're supposed to sell the food by versus when the food is freshest versus when it's actually not safe to eat. And so a lot of people will use expiration labels and throw food out when it is actually perfectly good. And of course, we also have the supersizing phenomenon, which can lead to a lot of food wastage in our fridges. Eliminating half of the food wastage just from the crops eaten directly by people could provide sufficient calories for nearly 1 billion people. So this food waste issue is really huge. If we could just get that under control, that would certainly help to reduce stress on the system and provide more food for those who need it. So what sort of actions do we need to take to alter these key variables so that we don't need to double food production in the future? So for population, it seems clear that empowering women's choice of people's choice, men's choice as well, of smaller family size, and most importantly, providing access to contraception and to information about contraception to meet the unmet need for family planning could greatly reduce population growth in the future and keep us at a more manageable and sustainable level. And here we have real examples of how this has already happened. Strongly supporting that this happens throughout the places where it's needed is really important. On diet, we need policies, education, and outreach to reduce meat consumption in the high meat consuming countries and economic sectors of countries. But at the same time, we also really need to think about people that currently don't have access to enough meat and the critical micronutrients it supplies. So promoting mixed crop livestock farming systems to increase access to meat in low meat consuming regions and economic sectors is also important. And for food waste, we need policies, education, outreach, and infrastructure, depending on the country, to help reduce it. Because if we can break these trends locally, nationally, and globally, then we don't need to double world food production. We need to continue producing maybe not as much food as we do already, but we need to continue producing food and getting it out to people. So that's, I think, where our real challenges are. We need to deal not just with the future problems of a larger population and a population that's consuming differently, but we need to put in place a system for feeding the people that we already have on the planet while we're working to break these trends. So I want to shift into the second part of my talk, thinking really about shifting our perspective from one that is a food aid perspective to more a food sovereignty perspective. And here I think we have some encouraging movements that are both top-down and grassroots. And I'll start with the top-down movement, and that's the United Nations Right to Food movement. So here's a statement of what the Right to Food movement aims to achieve. We had here at Berkeley Olivier de Schutter as our visiting scholar a few years ago. He is really the architect of, in many ways, of this Right to Food movement. The Right to Food movement primarily aims to guarantee to each person, individually or as part of a group, permanent and secure access to diets that are adequate from the nutritional point of view, sustainably produced, and culturally acceptable. The right to food is closely related to the right of access to resources such as land, water, forests, and seeds that are essential to those who produce food for their own consumption. So the Right to Food movement is a combination of governments working with human rights institutions and civil society along with social movements. And it's had some notable accomplishments. 25 countries now explicitly stipulate the right to food in their constitutions, and additional countries include right to food in their various policies. And so what this does is it addresses root causes of hunger and malnutrition by providing legal backing. In other words, and a quote from some of Olivier's work, victims of violations are entitled to adequate reparation, which may take the form of restitution, compensation, satisfaction, or guarantees of non-repetition. So the idea is to really create a legal basis for people having the ability to, the right not only to food, but also the right to produce the food that they need. So it's a move away from food aid towards self-sufficiency. And then from the bottom-up side, our social movements, the food sovereignty movement in particular, La Via Campesina, is a global people's coalition that seeks a radical change to the global food system. And their definition of food sovereignty is people's right to healthy and culturally appropriate food produced through ecologically sound and sustainable methods, and their right to define their own food and agricultural system. It puts those who produce, distribute, and consume food at the heart of food systems and policies rather than the demands of markets and corporations. And I think that is the critical piece here. The food sovereignty movement is a very broad worldwide movement of growers and peasants around the world, and they have many different kinds of actions. They've sought land reform and accomplished land reform. They've converted lands from industrial to agroecological farming. They've challenged transnational corporations and the World Trade Organization. They've set up programs of farmer-to-farmer training in agroecology, seed-saving networks, and other things. And so I think that they're very effective. So between these bottom-up movements and many other bottom-up movements as well, including local food policy councils and regional food initiatives, we have, I think, a move towards food sovereignty that is happening and that is also gaining strength through these legal mechanisms from the top down. So both the right to food movements and the food sovereignty movement endorse agroecology as a key approach for achieving food sovereignty. So I want to talk now about shifting perspectives, moving from industrial agriculture to agroecology. And what is really appropriate about agroecology for the right to food and food sovereignty movements is that agroecological methods tend to be low technology and low cost, but they're very knowledge and labor intensive. So they're very appropriate, for example, for developing economies where there's often lots of labor and not lots of technology and not lots of money to purchase inputs. Agroecological methods can really improve on the sustainability of farming systems, and they can also greatly improve on productivity compared to subsistence methods. So when they replace subsistence methods, they can really improve productivity, as well as stacking up pretty well and sometimes better than our conventional agricultural systems. So agroecological methods create what I like to think of as diversified farming systems. And I think it's this diversification that is really the key to the sustainability that's inherent in agroecological methods. We can think about the many techniques that agroecological methods use as being arrayed from along scales from plot to field to landscape scale. And I'm sure you've heard from some of the farmers who spoke in the class earlier about some of these different methods. So at the plot scale, we have things like composting and no-till agriculture, intercropping, that's sort of within the field. We might add strips of flowers that are there just really to support beneficial insects. Rotating crops or cover cropping occurs at the whole field scale and is very important to diversify across time. We might have hedgerows and hedgerows around the fields that support beneficial insects, and we might have riverine areas or riparian areas that have forest around them, and we might have natural habitat. So from plot to field to landscape scale, these kinds of build up in scale, and they're important in terms of providing and supporting key inputs to agriculture: nutrients, water, soil fertility, pest control, and pollination. And so if we just look as an example at the plot scale, how this can happen. So compost and no-till agriculture together help to provide an environment, a habitat that builds the soil's microbiome, and also biota, so all kinds of different organisms are living in the soil, and creates that soil fertility. At the same time, having all that compost in there is organic matter that serves as this huge sponge that soaks up water, provides a lot of resilience in times of drought, and meets the water out to plants. So all of these three important components here. Our intercropping here is important because it supports beneficial insects like pollinators and also natural enemies of crop pests. And it does this by providing different floral resources across time and also by reducing the concentration of resources that attracts specialist pests. So here we have this set of techniques at the plot scale that have so many important ramifications for the agricultural system. And when you think about it, pretty much all of these techniques are positively supporting multiple components of the agricultural system, multiple inputs, if you will, to the agricultural system, or multiple ecosystem services. And they're doing that by supporting the underlying agrobiodiversity. And it's a regenerative sort of system. They support this underlying agrobiodiversity, which provides the services that are needed in the agricultural system, so the agricultural system can be productive. So here's what a diversified farming system might look like. You have smaller fields, different types of things being planted, row crops and mixed crops and orchards. You have some hedgerows around the fields, you have some riparian buffers, you have meadows with livestock, and you have some natural areas here. So all the different elements from plot to field to landscape scale are part of this diversified farming system. I was explaining this in a talk I gave about pollinators to the California State Board of Agriculture, and I showed this picture. And at the end, in the question and answer session, one of the growers said, "That's a farm where we'd all like to live." which I thought was a really neat comment because it suggests that this is a good place for people as well as for agriculture. And there's an aesthetic and cultural appeal to this farm as well. And somehow hidden in his comment was, that's the farm where we'd all like to live, but we don't all live on that farm. That's not the way our farming system is. Wouldn't it be nice if we could get there? So instead, we don't live on that farm. We have really changed the dominant model of industrialized agriculture is really a monoculture landscape. It's not that diversified landscape at all. And when that happens, it breaks these links between the agricultural system and all of these key inputs. And that means that instead, we have to essentially replace the ecosystem services that were being generated by that system and regenerated by that system, which really is the essence of sustainability. And we have to replace them, so that we need these chemical fertilizers that depend on fossil fuels to be produced. We're going to substitute all that water use efficiency and water storage by groundwater pumping and irrigation, and we're going to get into deep problems with the groundwater pumping. We're going to substitute those pest control services with pesticides, again, fossil fuel dependent, create lots of toxins. And we're going to substitute those natural pollination services with honeybees that we import into the field. And we do produce a lot of food this way, as we've talked about earlier today. But the problem is that we also produce a lot of negative externalities, things that we don't want. From pesticide poisoning to lowered water tables to biodiversity loss, poverty, malnutrition, obesity, conflict. So what about these biologically diversified farming systems? What's the evidence that they improve ecosystem services relative to the chemically intensive monoculture farming systems? Well, we do have a lot of evidence for this, and we, myself and many others, have done a huge amount of work, a huge literature review to bring together this information, and I can confidently say to you that the services that are important to farmers, which are the ones I showed on the diagram before, definitely these agroecological systems, these diversified farming systems, definitely produce a lot of these critical services important to farmers, and they also produce a lot of services that are perhaps not so critical for farmers, but are really important for the public, like biodiversity, habitat for biodiversity, improved water quality, reduced energy use, and carbon sequestration that can help with our climate change issues. So one of the questions that always comes up is, if you're going to have these agroecological farms, these diversified farms, and sure, they're better for the environment, but what about yield? Are they going to be reduced in yield? And is that going to be a problem? So I'd like to look first at a really old study, but still an important one. And this study looked at a large number of sustainable agricultural projects across 57 countries, and representing really a large number of farmers, 12 million farmers and 36 million hectares. And what they did was to compare resource conserving measures with unimproved, or in other words, mostly with subsistence farming. And the kinds of resource conserving practices they looked at were integrated pest management, agroforestry, aquaculture, livestock integration, integrated nutrient management, conservation tillage, and water harvesting. Okay, so these are a whole lot more techniques. Often these relate to the ones that I showed you earlier in the diversified farming diagram as being collections of several of those techniques that I mentioned. So agroforestry, for example, is going to incorporate tree species and understory crops at the same time, or other species in the understory. So that's like a form of intercropping in a way. So let's look at the data. In fact, in this study, they found pretty much across the board for many different crops that there was a significant improvement in yields when farmers took up some of these kinds of techniques. So they were getting better yields by also doing more sustainable practices. This study has definitely been critiqued extensively. There are two main criticisms. One is that some of the subjects, some of the studies were before-after studies that did not have a control, so other things could have been going on. There could have been other changes happening at the level of the country, economic changes or whatever, that could have caused what we see here. And the other critique is that these are farmers that had already adopted these techniques and had stuck with it and were successful. So it's not a random sample that might have included also farmers who took up the technique but then later abandoned it. So these are problems, but on the other hand, I think that it's pretty exciting that this can work. Perhaps not all farmers are, and certainly not all farmers are successful when they take up a new technique, but here's a rather significant sample of farmers that took up these techniques and were successful and did improve yields. And so I think it's important information. And in another study that's more recent, again looked at yield comparisons of a number of different kinds of techniques: conservation agriculture, holistic grazing management, precision agriculture, system of rice intensification, and organic agriculture. And then again, without going too much into what these different systems are, again, they're using different sets of the techniques I mentioned earlier. What this shows is that yield was either increased in these relative to conventional, or it stayed the same for the majority, about 65% in the case of conservation agriculture, up to about 95% in the case of system of rice intensification for these first four techniques. So what this means is that with these techniques that are going to do better in terms of sustainability, they're not really, they're often as good or better than the conventional. So that suggests that there's definitely some positive here. What about with organic? Here we don't see very many where the yield is actually improved or the same as conventional agriculture. We have much more conventional agriculture having higher, we have many more studies in which organic agriculture showed yield gaps or yield losses compared to conventional agriculture. So what's going on with that? Well, we did a study in my lab that looked at what is that differential. And what we found by bringing all the original data together is that, yeah, there is a yield gap, but it isn't that large of a gap. So yes, often we do find that organic agriculture produces lower yields than conventional agriculture, but the amount of the yield gap is about 20%. And that would be a lot for an individual farmer. On the other hand, often farmers are going to make that up because what they care about is not yield, but profit and livelihood. And so if they can get an economic advantage through marketing organic food, then that yield differential really might not matter to them. And I think that you might be hearing from some farmers later on in the course that Carl Rosado hasn't been here yet. Right, has he been here already? Has been here. Okay, so you've already heard from Carl Rosado, and I think that that would very much be the case for that farm, for example. So the yield gap is not really that large. And a couple of interesting things, when we looked a little bit more closely, there's a wide spectrum of ways of doing organic farming. Some organic farms pretty much do monoculture farming, and other organic farms are doing intercropping, and they're doing cover cropping and rotations and all kinds of things. And what we found is that this yield gap could really be reduced, become much smaller, when the organic farms were making use of polyculture, for example, or when they were doing much more complex rotations than the conventional farms. Then that yield gap really diminished. So that shows the importance of these diversifying factors for productivity. And another really important thing is it a yield gap between organic and conventional, or is it a knowledge gap? And this is some information from several former students here at UC Berkeley, looking at the amount of the U.S. Department of Agriculture funding for research, education, and extension, how much of it goes to conventional versus organic. And here you can see it's not even 2% of the funding is going to organic. Most of it's going to conventional. And given that research gap, the knowledge gap, we could ask the question, given the huge investment in research to improve conventional agriculture, why is the differential between conventional and organic agriculture so small? Why hasn't conventional agriculture done much, much better than that, given all that research investment? If we had that research investment for organic, my belief is that we could really reduce or eliminate, or perhaps even reverse, this yield gap. So I want to talk a little bit about two examples where research is helping, where some concentrated research effort has gone forward and where it is improving the yield question. So the first one's going to be about pollinators. That's what I work on myself. So let me give you a little bit of background to start with. We now grow, of course, here in California, crops in these huge monocultures. And when we do that, it creates a very large demand for pollinators. All these blossoms here need to be visited by a bee. And when they're grown in such large arrays, really the only way we can do it is to import the European honeybee in large numbers. So each of these colonies then will have 50 to 100,000 individuals. And they'll be literally transported right out onto the farm field. In California, we bring in 1 million of these colonies every year to pollinate things like almond and sunflower and watermelon and other crops. And of course, when we're growing things in monoculture like this, they're often very susceptible to pests. So we use a lot of pesticides in these kinds of cropping systems. And one of the kinds of pesticides that has become very prevalent recently are neonicotinoid pesticides. And these are pesticides that they actually put on the seed. So these are seeds that have been coated with the neonicotinoid pesticides. And recently, these pesticides have been implicated in the phenomenon of colony collapse disorder. They're not the only contributor, but they're one of probably many contributors that are synergizing to cause the loss of honeybee colonies, massive losses that you've probably heard about. And that means that now the honeybee has become sort of a weak link in the chain from field to fork. But we also have all of these native pollinators, and it's not just people that like to live here. Native pollinators also like to live in these kinds of diversified farms. And research that we've done on farms like this, like Full Belly Farm as an example, we really find native pollinators alone can provide sufficient pollination services for crops. We don't need to import honeybees when we have cropping systems like this. And we've done more detailed research that looks at specific elements, like, for example, the polyculture. The polyculture is important in improving multiple different crop types are important in improving bee diversity and abundance to provide those pollination services. We've looked at the hedgerows, and again, we find these hedgerows are really important in promoting healthy bee communities that can provide pollination services. And we've looked at the natural habitats surrounding the farm fields and how important they are in providing these pollinator communities. And going out to more of to generalize from our results, here's our studies that have contributed to this much larger global synthesis. And interestingly, in this study, we found that consistently there are increases in crop yields in response to native pollinator visits. And this is much more consistent than the increase in crop yields due to honeybees. So it turns out native pollinators around the world are being found to actually be better contributors to pollination than the managed honeybees that we import. So here is a strong case for research to identify these interactions and these interlinkages to build the case for diversified agriculture. And another case that I want to briefly tell you about is a fascinating study where a huge amount of research went into solving a really big problem. Here, corn is one of the main staple crops, and other grains as well, in Africa. And they were having tremendous losses due to an insect called the stem borer. So these are the larvae of the stem borer. It was leading to 80% losses in the maize plants. And at the same time, there was another pest, which is a parasitic weed, a weed that parasitizes the roots of the corn. And that was leading sometimes up to 100% of losses, especially in combination. So this was affecting a large area of Kenya and other countries in Africa as well. So this really intricate research effort went forward to come up with a new system that would work better. And what they found was if they planted a grass called Napier grass near the corn, that it would actually attract, by emitting chemicals, certain chemicals, it would attract the stem borers out into the Napier grass, and they would lay their eggs on the Napier grass instead of on the corn. But then when the larvae began to feed, it would cause the Napier grass to emit a sticky substance that would literally envelop the larvae and trap them and kill them. So this was a very effective way of controlling the population. And another thing that they did was to plant another plant called, it's a nitrogen fixer called Desmodium, which emitted chemicals that actually repelled the stem borer moths away from the corn. And so that would push them out into the Napier grass where that trapping could happen. And at the same time, this amazing plant would not only fix nitrogen, but also produce yet another chemical, a root exudate, that would cause those little parasitic weed seeds to germinate, but would not allow them to attach to the maize roots. And so it would cause what's suicidal germination is the literal term. So this is an amazing system, and there must be like 50 papers, 50 research papers that were produced to develop this incredibly intricate system with a knowledge of the detailed chemical ecology. Here's what it looks like in place. And then looking at some data of what's actually happened. The white bars here are always the push-pull system compared with just the regular maize monocrop system. And so what you see here in the top panel is that the striga weed is decreasing greatly. You see the stem borers are decreasing greatly. And then you see the yields are increasing greatly, about doubling of yields. So it's a really effective system. And they've also looked a little bit further out from just that system and the effect on the corn to look at other things too, because the Napier grass is actually a fodder grass. It's a grass that can be used in cattle production. So it becomes really, really powerful. You've got the control of these two pests. You've got increased crop yields, but you've also got increased fodder production because of the Napier grass, which improves cattle health. That improves dairy production, which improves human nutrition. And also the improved cattle health leads to more manure that improves soil health. You've also got the nitrogen fixing Desmodium that also improves soil health. And because you have all of these things happening, you have increased household income, which leads to empowerment of women. So you have it all, basically. And the point is that these agroecological approaches have a large potential for providing a holistic solution, something that's more than let's just increase yields. Here we're increasing yields, but so many other things are happening here, and that's what's really important. We need these holistic solutions. So to sum up this section on, and I'm getting close to the end here, why agroecology matters, why we need to make this shift from industrial agriculture to agroecology. These diversified agroecological systems provide significant benefits for sustainability, as I've shown, and also they're also highly productive, particularly compared to subsistence systems, but I'd argue with enhanced research they can really stand up there with the conventional systems too. These systems are typically operated in small to mid-sized farms, and that's why it's really important when we think about supporting, getting rid of this hunger issue. We need to be supporting small to mid-sized farmer. That's the key to reducing world hunger for two reasons. The first reason is because smallholders are actually producing a large proportion of the food. I've seen different estimates, but it's somewhere between 50 and 70%. So we need to support them because they're producing so much of the food. Of those smallholders, it's estimated that about half of them are currently using resource conserving or agroecological methods. That's great that half of them are already doing this, but that means that half of them aren't doing it. And so there's room for improvement in both productivity and sustainability if we could get the other 50% to uptake these methods, if we could provide the support, the extension, and the research that's needed so that they could uptake these methods and improve their own livelihoods. And the other reason is that small-scale farmers make up a huge number of the farms and also the majority of the people who are paradoxically hungry or malnourished. So again, it's really important to be able to improve the productivity of the small-scale farmers for their own livelihoods, and so that we can deal with this hunger problem because they're actually making up a large component of it. So I want to talk about my final point now, which is thinking about the shift from corporate control to democratically determined food systems. And so it's important to think about how is the food system currently organized. We have about 1.5 billion people that produce food and 7 billion that consume it. But we have a very small number of companies that provide some of the key inputs for farming, the seeds, the fertilizers, the machinery. And we also have a very small number of agri-food companies that are purchasing the food, or purchasing the raw materials from the producers and transforming it into the myriads of products that are on our supermarket shelves and selling it to us. So in a world with 7 billion food consumers and 1.5 billion food producers, no more than 500 companies control 70% of food choice. It's kind of amazing. So the growers are really in between these input companies that they have to purchase key inputs from, and the agri-food industries, as particularly the traders and processors that are purchasing the products from them. And because there are so few purchasers and so few input companies, these companies have a lot of control on what the growers are doing. And so the growers are getting squeezed. And I think a really evocative way to illustrate this is by looking at the seed industry. And this is a diagram that was produced by Phil Howard at Michigan State University, and really amazingly evocative work. What you see here is how all of these companies, each of these ovals here represents a company, how they're now all sort of related and subsumed by much larger companies. And so these big red circles here are chemical companies that have purchased many of the seed companies. And so we see familiar names: Monsanto, DuPont, I can't read these very well, but Syngenta, Dow, and Bayer. I think Bayer's up here and Dow's here. They've purchased all these seed companies, so now they're selling seeds. And so the growers actually don't have that many options as, where are they going to buy their seeds? It's probably going to end up, it looks like there's lots of companies, but there aren't really, because they've all been purchased. So, that means that these companies can exert an awful lot of control over what's available in terms of seeds. And it's interesting also that the chemical companies got into the seed business. Why is that? Well, it makes a lot of sense when you think that now not only neonicotinoids are packaged on seeds, but also a wide array of other pesticides, fungicides, for example, can be packaged. And sometimes a seed is packaged with several pesticides on it, a fungicide and a neonicotinoid or various others. So it's a way for the chemical companies to continue selling their products literally wrapped around the seed, or through genetic engineering, their chemical products can be produced inside the seed, as in the BT, Bacillus thuringiensis, or it could be that the genetic engineering requires the purchase of a companion pesticide like an herbicide like Roundup. So it makes sense that the chemical companies have done this, but it creates a lot of pressure on the growers. So the other way that smallholders are increasingly squeezed around the world is about access to land. Mean farm size for a smallholder has been decreasing in many places, and it's often too small to create a livelihood. And this is why we have a phenomenon of poverty and hunger often on smallholder farms. This is related to land grabs, which are displacing smallholders from their lands. And I'd like to just give you a moment to read the comic strip, which pretty much sums it up. And let me go into my final slide here for my talk, and then I want to talk just a little bit about the Berkeley Food Institute. So encouraging this shift from food aid to food sovereignty. With the food sovereignty piece, we've already got really great grassroots movements happening and really great international policies promoting food sovereignty. So we just need to continue to support these and to grow these movements, because I think this is really critical and important. For agroecology, we really need a lot more research to demonstrate its effectiveness and to fine-tune and optimize agroecological performance. We need policies also to support diversified farming systems and agroecology, as well as extension services and the support to support small and mid-sized growers. And I think really the key is in here in the food democracy. This is the critical thing and probably the toughest nut to crack, because we need policies that support smallholders' access to land, credit, seeds, other inputs and markets. Policies to the counter to that is policies to limit monopolization of markets and inputs by multinational corporations. We need policies to promote local and regional food systems and to promote equitable living wages for food system workers, because we need to think about the whole supply chain. And so that's a good segue to talk about a little bit about the Berkeley Food Institute, because here all of you students are here at Berkeley and you can take advantage of the Berkeley Food Institute being here. Our mission is to support transformative changes in food systems to promote diversity, justice, resilience, and health from local to global. And you can see that this very much mirrors some of the other things that I've been saying today. BFI envisions a world in which nutritious, affordable food is available for all and is produced sustainably and fairly, ensuring healthy people and healthy planet. And how are we doing this? Well, we're still a very young organization. We only really started late in 2012. One of the important role that we play is we're a hub. We are a collection of the College of Natural Resources, the School of Journalism, the School of Public Health, the School of Public Policy, the School of Law, and we also have many faculty that are outside of these large institutes here at Berkeley. So we have 105 affiliated faculty members. It's really important that we have so many different kinds of people working on this problem because, as you can see, these are really, really difficult, complex issues. There are no easy solutions. And our goal is really to break down some of the silos between different kinds of disciplines and the colleges here on campus. And so we serve as a hub in that way. And it's also really important that we can reach out outside the university. So we're really forging links with a lot of other groups, with NGOs and also with government, with farmers themselves, and with civil society. And we work in a variety of ways. We support interdisciplinary action-oriented research. We're working on developing a food systems minor. We support the edible education course. We are working on making the connection between the research that's conducted here on campus and policy initiatives and really getting the research out to where it needs to be done. And we're working on also translating this research into practice and working with communities. We work in these 4 different areas of sustainable agriculture and ecosystems, society and culture, economics and business, labor and justice. And through all of it, we see that health is an important linking theme, the health of the planet and the health of people. If you're interested, check us out at food.berkeley.edu. There's also some flyers that outside that talk about our event, which is actually happening next week. Monday from 2 to 6, we have a panel series on fostering resilience and health of the food systems in the face of drought, obviously very appropriate for California today. And this is going to be in the David Brower Center. If you're interested, pick up one of those flyers or check out our website. Today I've talked about a lot of people's work, including some from my own lab. And I just want to acknowledge the many people who have provided insights to me through their work or through conversations. And I also want to thank you for attending, and all of the people out there who I can't see for listening. And I'm going to sit down in the chair now and take any questions and engage in conversation with you. Thank you. There's water over there. So, if we got any questions from the people that are here? Yes? You want to?
Hi. My
Hi.
question has to do, I was just wondering, I hear the word sustainable thrown around a lot, and we've been given a lot of definitions in this class. And I was just wondering, based on the context of your lecture, I was just wondering what your idea of sustainability is and how we can achieve it as students, especially right now with the drought.
Okay, that's a great question. Well, I think that sustainability is a really big concept, and it's also very difficult to define. I think that it is very important to include the ecological, social, and economic components, that we need to think about all of those components when we think about sustainability. I think that in the ecological component, for me, I am an ecologist, so I tend to think in that realm a lot. The notion of maintaining our ecosystem services is really critical. And so the notion that whatever actions we take need to be regenerative, they need to restore those ecosystem services. They can't just use them up. I think that's critical to the notion of sustainability. We really can't have sustainability without that. And so that means that there's a large component of biodiversity that needs to be sustained in order to maintain those ecosystem services. Yes?
I'll just speak. So, I mean, we think about food and just like climate change in general. It's like, I feel like the biggest issue is people either don't know or they just don't care. You know what I mean? I mean, I just get done playing football here, and just being around athletes or people in general, just being around in entertainment, people just, they just like don't care. And so it's like, what do you think is the best solution to get, mainstream society involved? I mean, I know one person on my team are saying is, well, why should I care? Because it's not affecting me, I mean, until, like pertaining to the drought, until my water gets turned off, or until I don't get to eat cheeseburgers from In-N-Out, I'm not going to care. I mean, do you think this is done through education or creating, market mechanisms to get, or bigger food companies to buy in? I mean, like, what do you see as like solutions to get, mainstream people to start caring about this subject?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that we need to have a lot of conversations. We need to talk to people a lot about what it could mean for them and paint vivid pictures of what the future could be like if we continue on these trajectories. There's some great work by some folks in Sweden about planetary boundaries and showing sort of how we've transgressed already certain planetary boundaries. I think that work is very evocative. There's also the work of on the ecological footprint that shows how many how we're, again, borrowing from the future. The idea is that we're already using more than Earth's capacity to produce the resources that we need. So I think that sometimes it's imagery like that you really need to use to be able to show people what the impact is now and how that's going to continue, how if we continue along this trajectory, what's going to happen. And I realized I forgot to answer the second part of your question about what people can do now for sustainability. And I think that one thing that's really important is to think about what you really need versus what maybe you want to purchase. There's lots of things that we purchase all the time that we don't really need. And every time we purchase something, even if it was sustainably produced, there was an impact associated with that. So I think we need to get, in our own personal lives, we need to get beyond this need to always have more things. And we also need to start moving societies towards an understanding that you could have prosperity, good livelihoods and human well-being without the GDP necessarily having to continually go up. So we have to get to the sort of beyond growth perspective if we want to achieve sustainability.
We have one question from social media. How have different large-scale farms responded to colony collapse? Have they kind of changed their ways, or how have different governments dealt with it?
Great question. I wouldn't say that large-scale farms have changed their ways yet. There definitely are some concerns. The growers that are the most concerned are the almond growers, because they're very, very dependent on honeybees, and they need a lot of them all at one time. One of the ways that the almond industry has responded is a long-term project that they've done to basically breed a tree that is independent of pollinators. And the variety is actually called independent. One of the problems with that, though, is, of course, the trees are fairly long-lived, and they do now have this independent variety. But it's not clear whether the farmers that are they already have their trees. They're not going to just rip out all their trees and put this one in. And it's also not clear if it meets all of the market standards yet. So that's the kind of solution of, this is a specific problem, let's get a specific fix for it. It might work, but it's not a very sort of long-term or holistic solution. If you only had the independent variety, there'd probably be some other problem that would come up with that.
Hi. Excuse me. Yeah. Hi. One of the questions that I had was, I was curious, it was really interesting that you said that 500 companies control 70% of our food choice. And I was wondering if you were aware of any partnerships with these companies, or is it more about limiting their choice and empowering small and medium-sized farmers?
I think there's a lot that can be done by working with companies. And in fact, the same constriction of the supply chain that we see that could be a negative, in the sense that those companies have so much control over what the grower does, and also what the grower can purchase in terms of inputs, could also be a positive. I mean, there are examples. For example, there's the soy moratorium on deforestation in Brazil. There was a lot of pressure put mostly from European nations on soy importing companies and there were only a few of them, to make sure that the tropical forests weren't being replaced by soy. And so they had actually a very effective moratorium on soy companies, so that basically that source of deforestation has been eliminated, at least in that part of the supply chain. So it can actually be good if you're only if there's only a few companies to work with, and you can exert a lot of pressure on those companies. That can be very effective. So it's kind of a double-edged thing.
Hi. So I had a question about the UN Right to Food movement. You were talking about how there's more of a push for governments to have policy regarding people's right to food, and that they could get compensation or reparations or whatever if they don't. So my question is about the impact of that and the effectiveness of it, because just intuitively, if a person is struggling from malnutrition, they're not going to be suing the government for their reparations for the fact they don't have food. So how how is that implemented, and how does that actually have an impact, or is it just more of a nominal change? Yeah,
that's a good question, and I don't have specific cases to give you, but I think that that's where these partnerships come into play, that it really isn't just whenever you have a policy, it's about the policy and it's about enforcing the policy. And both of those can be difficult. Getting the policy put in place in the first place is difficult, but then if there's no follow-up, then it's really not effective. And so I think that's where these sort of partnerships come into play between, I mentioned early on, the Right to Food movement as governments along with NGOs and civil society. So I think that NGOs would need to play a large role there in actually enforcing policies in specific countries. I don't have detailed knowledge about that, but I think that's probably what's playing out.
Hi. So in regards to California specifically, Governor Brown's office has come out with this new mandate for cities to reduce water consumption by 25%. I don't know if you've seen that. But I just want to know what implications that has for California and sustainable agriculture here, and how does that come into play with these kind of shifts that we're talking about, and where policy is, constricting urban centers rather than agriculture.
So where policies, so your question is really about
just what do you think, what implications does this kind of stuff have on?
Well, my first reaction is that I think that sustainable agriculture has so much more capacity to be resilient to drought, whether it's taking place in an urban center or outside of an urban center. I'm not sure if that was really what your question was directed at, but there's actually some really good research on how in times of drought, various types of sustainable agricultural systems do so much better than conventional systems, and the reason for that is clear. It's really about taking care of the soil. So I mentioned earlier that if you can really generate a lot of organic matter in the soil, which is what most, I think all sustainable agricultural techniques are really oriented towards building that organic matter in the soil, then it really acts as a way of bringing water into the soil, storing water in the soil. And our fearless leader over here, Gary Sposito, knows a lot more about this than I do, but it's the green water that's so important, is storing the water in the soil, as well as recharging the water into the groundwater system. And so with those things, sustainable agricultural systems become much more resilient to drought because whatever water is there, they've stored it. When you have a drought that's super long lasting and you're not getting any precipitation at all, everything is going to really have a lot of trouble though. I mean, so there's other bigger issues related to climate change that also are coming into play. And I think that there's also the capacity for sustainable agriculture to serve not only as a climate change adaptation strategy, but also as a mitigation strategy. So it's important in both of those ways.
Hi, me again. So my question has to do with the human labor behind food production, as we've talked a lot about in this class. And so my question, then I have like a couple points to kind of clarify it. So I'm wondering about the link that you see between environmental health or ecological health and human labor. We've talked about in this class that industrial agriculture and modes of production are very unhealthy and unequitable for workers, whether that be in the field or in slaughterhouses across America. But also that the organic label, which is very, positive for the environment, doesn't really mean anything for human labor. There was a farmer who was here when Eric Schlosser was here and talked about how she worked on an organic farm and conventional farms, and that the treatment wasn't any different besides not being exposed to pesticides. And I was wondering where the focus should be if we had to choose between focusing just on improving ecological health or human health and human labor. Is it possible to improve one and then to directly improve the other? Or we're just trying to understand where our attention should be if we can isolate it in that way.
That seems like an impossible choice.
Yeah, I know.
So I guess I would say that no, I don't think that we should be prioritizing one over the other. It seems to me that it should be very feasible to have both. I think that with sustainable agricultural systems, they're more labor intensive. It's undoubtedly true that they require more labor, and because of that can often be a critique. How will we do it? Where will the labor come from? And I think that given farming conditions today, why would anybody want to go into farming? They wouldn't. It's a terrible lifestyle. I'm talking about from the worker side, not necessarily the grower or owner side, but from the employee side, there are so many inequities, and the situation for farm workers has been really bad, and it isn't necessarily better on organic farms. So where would you get the labor from? Who's going to want to do it? I think that it's necessary to improve the conditions for farm workers, part and parcel or hand in hand with a move towards more diversified, sustainable agriculture. I think that they could go very naturally together. I mean, one great thing about sustainable agricultural methods that are not using many pesticides or any pesticides is that you at least remove that factor of negativity for human health, for the labor and the human health situation. So then what you need is other policies and practices put in place to ensure that people are getting a fair wage, to ensure that the working conditions are good, that it is not an enslavement situation, and that people have varied work and breaks and restrooms and all the things that people need in a good working environment. And I think that more and more, we see growers that are putting together these kinds of systems and making them profitable and able to also take care of their workers too. So it is feasible, but it isn't yet broadly adopted.
I was curious to hear you talk about the photos on the first slide, which you never did, the 3 families and what they ate. And it seemed clear just from looking at it that the family in the U.S. was eating a lot more processed food and meat, and the families that were spending less were eating a lot more legumes, grains, and local produce. And you mentioned that the more countries become industrialized, the more they're going to want to eat like us, which is, of course, a huge mistake for them and for the planet, not only because it's bad for the planet, but also because it's bad for their health. They'll get the same disease that we have. I'm just wondering how anybody could reverse that trend. What could possibly make them not want to eat more like us and make us want to eat more like them? And who's working on that?
Well, I think the first thing is that, it would be great if we could stop eating like us, for starters, because it isn't, as you pointed out, not good for us, and it's not good. It's not a good model, and we do kind of export ourselves through, media to other countries. And so if we could stop eating like us, then that would be a good thing, I think, to help reduce the uptake of other people eating like us. But it probably also does come back to my last point about the corporate entities, and they're making a lot of money selling these things. And they also have a huge amount of ability to shape consumer demands through marketing and advertisements. And so as long as that is continuing, then we continue to perpetuate this cycle, not only here but elsewhere. And I think that they are really marketing to the third world as well, and that's why these trends are starting there too. What do we do about it? I mean, that to me, that last bullet item is the biggest, most problematic, and I don't have the answers. I like to say, as an ecologist, I really don't know. It's really, really difficult territory, I think, to figure that out. But I think that, we can all try to do our individual best to change how we eat and to talk with people about what is a good way to eat. That's what we can do individually.
Yeah, we have another question. Earlier in the lecture, you showed how 1% of USDA's research funding goes towards organic agriculture. As a researcher, what would you say is being underfunded? What research is being underfunded? Where would you look into?
I would put a lot more money, not just into organic agriculture, but into agroecological research. I think that there's just huge numbers of issues that we could be tackling. We need to, like the system that I showed, the African system of the controlling the stem borer and the striga. That was a huge amount of research investment by a number of different institutions. I don't know how much money it cost, but there was a lot of investment of people and talent at these particular pest issues. We have pest issues in every single crop system that's out there. They need that kind of attention. If we want to develop really clever agroecological solutions, we need to put that kind of research investment problem by problem. And a problem that is here in California, the same crop might be grown elsewhere and have different problems. So they're very kind of location specific as well. So I think that there's just a large amount of research that could be done to improve agroecological systems, to meet the needs that growers have that are trying to use these systems now. So we could poll all the growers and get their wishes and desires, and it would be easy to come up with a list of things that need to be done. Okay, so I think we're good. Thank you very much.